The air in the studio hung heavy, as if time itself had paused. Soft golden lights cast a warm glow on the polished wooden floor, glinting off the silent cameras poised in wait. No laughter from the crew, no idle chatter, typical before a shoot. Only a profound stillness enveloped the room, as though it were holding its breath, bracing for something far greater than a mere interview. At the center, two leather chairs faced each other, separated by a small wooden table. On one chair sat Keanu Reeves, quiet, his hands resting gently on an old-worn Bible. Its leather cover was frayed, its yellowed pages whispering tales of time. The book didn't look like it belonged to a Hollywood star. It seemed more like an old friend, a companion through long, solitary nights and unanswered questions. Keanu sat there still as ever. His deep, pensive eyes seemed to gaze somewhere distant beyond the studio walls. A simple black suit hugged his frame, but it couldn't conceal the weariness etched on his face. Not physical exhaustion, but something deeper, as if he carried an unseen burden. He didn't shift, didn't adjust his posture, only gently caressed the Bible's cover, seeking comfort in its touch. No one in the crew dared break the silence. They sensed something unusual, something unnameable, yet powerful enough to make them pause. The door behind the stage creaked open, and Jonathan Roumie stepped in. The man who portrayed Jesus in The Chosen carried a calm demeanor, but his eyes widened slightly when he saw Keanu and the Bible in his hands. "Mr. Reeves," Jonathan said, his voice soft but tinged with surprise. He approached, extending a hand. "I wasn't expecting this." Keanu looked up, offering a faint smile, his eyes still shadowed with a quiet melancholy. He stood shaking Jonathan's hand but didn't rush to speak. "I didn't think I'd do this either," he replied, his voice low and deliberate, each word carefully chosen. "But lately something shifted." He paused, glancing at the Bible, then back at Jonathan. "I need to understand, and I think you can help." Jonathan took the seat opposite, his expression shifting. The initial surprise gave way to a deep focus, as if he were preparing to hear a story that belonged not just to Keanu, but to himself as well. 30 seconds, the floor director's voice called from behind, but no one paid it mind. The space between the two men had become its own world, separate from the lights and cameras. Keanu placed the Bible on the table, his hands lingering on it, reluctant to let go. "I've never spoken about this publicly," he began, his voice quiet but clear, resonating in the hushed space. "Not to the press, not to friends. But recently I started reading this book. Not for easy answers, but because I feel something bigger is happening. And then I came across the name Persia, Iran today." He paused, looking directly at Jonathan. "It's everywhere in the Bible from beginning to end. I want to know why. Why does one nation persist like that, from Genesis to the final prophecies? What does it mean?" Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with curiosity and respect. He didn't answer immediately, letting Keanu's question settle. "That's a big question." He finally said, his voice warm and steady, like a guide preparing to unfold a vast tale. "Persia, or Iran, isn't just a nation in the Bible. It's part of a greater plan woven by God from the very first pages of human history. Where do you want to start?" Keanu furrowed his brow, as if sorting through a tangle of thoughts. "From the beginning," he said, his voice firmer. "I read in Genesis about names like Magi and Elam. Who were they? How do they connect to Persia? And why would God choose a pagan nation like that to play a role in his story?" Jonathan gave a gentle smile, not because the question was simple, but because he saw Keanu reaching for something profound. "All right," he said, his voice calm, yet captivating, like a storyteller about to unveil a grand tapestry. "Let's start with Genesis, when the world was reborn after the Great Flood. Noah and his family were the only survivors, and from his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, new nations arose. In chapter 10, the Bible lists a map of nations, and there we find 2 key names, Magi and Elam." Jonathan paused, noting how intently Keanu listened, his hands still resting on the Bible. "Magi was Japheth's son," he continued. "His descendants, the Medes, settled in the northern mountains, what's now northern Iran. They were tough, independent tribes forged by the harsh terrain. Magi is the ancestor of ancient Persia's northern heartland. Elam, Shem's son, led his descendants, the Elamites, to fertile lands near the Persian Gulf in southwestern Iran. They built a powerful civilization, not a small tribe, but a formidable force. Keanu nodded, his eyes alight with curiosity. So they were two separate peoples. How did they become one? Persia. Jonathan leaned in, his voice growing more animated, as if guiding Keanu through a journey across time. Yes, they started apart. The Medes in the mountains, the Elamites in the plains. But their fates intertwined over centuries. In Genesis 14, we see Elam in the Bible's first recorded international war. 4 eastern kings, led by Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, attacked Canaan, plundering and taking Abraham's nephew Lot captive. Elam wasn't weak. They were a mighty empire bold enough to challenge God's people. Keanu frowned, his voice lowering. But Abraham defeated them right with just 318 men. Jonathan nodded, his eyes gleaming with awe, as if caught up in the tale himself. Exactly. Abraham, with only 318 trained warriors, pursued and crushed that powerful alliance. It was an impossible victory, as if God were sending a message. No Eastern power can prevail against those with his favor. But Elam's story didn't end there. They grew alongside the Medes in the land that would become the Persian Empire. The studio air seemed to thicken. Crew members, those stationed behind cameras, leaned forward, drawn into Jonathan's narrative. Keanu, still pensive, tapped his fingers lightly on the Bible. So from then on, Persia was destined to be part of God's plan. Even as pagans, Jonathan nodded, his voice softening with reverence. Precisely. Persia was never outside God's reach. Through prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, he revealed that Persia would play 2 major roles, a tool of judgment and a vessel of redemption. To understand that, we need to dive deeper into the era of King Cyrus and the prophecies that shaped history. Keanu leaned back, his eyes brightening, as if a vast picture were unfolding before him. The Bible on the table, though silent, seemed to whisper ancient stories waiting to be told. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice low, brimming with unguarded curiosity. Cyrus. I read about him in Isaiah, a pagan king yet chosen by God. That puzzles me. How could someone outside Israel become God's instrument, and why Persia among countless nations for that role? Jonathan nodded, his eyes lighting up as if he'd found a clear path to guide the story. That's a great question, Keanu, he replied, his voice warm, drawing them deeper into ancient history. To understand Cyrus, we must return to Israel's darkest hour. Jerusalem lay in ruins, the temple burned, and the people exiled to Babylon. They wept by the rivers, thinking hope was lost. But God never abandoned them. Through the prophet Isaiah, he promised something unthinkable: a pagan king would become their liberator. Keanu furrowed his brow, his hand instinctively touching the Bible. Isaiah named Cyrus, didn't he? Before he was even born, Jonathan nodded, his voice growing vibrant, as if recounting a miracle. Yes. Over 150 years before Cyrus's birth, Isaiah wrote, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus." A pagan king unaware of God called his anointed, a title typically reserved for Israel's kings. God declared Cyrus would defeat Babylon, free Israel, and order the temple's rebuilding in Jerusalem. It wasn't just prophecy. It was God's plan set before Persia became an empire. Keanu sat up straighter, his eyes wide with amazement, and it happened exactly like that. Jonathan smiled, but his smile carried reverence. To the letter. In the 8th century BC, Deioces, king of the Medes, united the tribes of Magi and Elam, laying Persia's foundation. His grandson, Cyaxares, turned the army into a war machine strong enough to destroy Nineveh, Assyria's capital, a brutal enemy of Israel. But it was Cyrus, uniting Medes and Persians, who brought Persia to its peak. He wasn't just a king, he was a whirlwind that reshaped history. Keanu nodded slowly, as if picturing the scene. I read in Daniel about Babylon's fall. How did Cyrus do it? Jonathan leaned in, his voice turning dramatic, as if reliving a fateful night. It was a night like no other. King Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, held a lavish feast in Babylon's palace. Thousands of nobles reveled, heedless of the Persian army encircling the city. In his arrogance, Belshazzar ordered the sacred vessels looted from Jerusalem's temple brought out to drink from toasting false gods. That was his final mistake. Keanu narrowed his eyes, sensing the tension. What happened next? Jonathan lowered his voice, as if sharing a secret. Suddenly, an invisible hand appeared, writing 4 words on the palace wall: Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin. No one understood them, not even Belshazzar. Trembling, he summoned Daniel, a Jewish captive, to interpret. Daniel stood before the court and declared, "God has numbered your reign and ended it. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." That very night, Cyrus's army, by diverting the Euphrates River, slipped into the city through the dry riverbed. Babylon's gates stood open as if God himself had unlocked them. Belshazzar was slain, and Babylon fell. Keanu exhaled as if he'd witnessed the scene. So Persia became the new empire. But what about Israel? What did Cyrus do for them? Jonathan nodded, his voice warming. Cyrus didn't stop at conquest. He did what no pagan king had done. He issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem after 70 years of exile. More than that, he funded the temple's rebuilding, providing resources and protection. Zerubbabel, a descendant of David's line, and Joshua the high priest led the people back, laying the first stones for the new temple. Persia, once a stranger, became Israel's guardian. Keanu tapped his fingers on the table, his eyes pensive. That makes me think, Persia wasn't just a tool to punish Babylon. It was a bridge for God to fulfill his promise. But why? Why choose a nation that didn't worship him? Jonathan looked at Keanu, his eyes filled with empathy. That's what makes the Bible unique, Keanu. God isn't bound by human boundaries. He can use anyone, any nation to fulfill his purpose. Persia, though pagan, was never beyond his reach. Through Isaiah and Jeremiah, he made it clear Persia would punish Babylon for destroying Jerusalem, but also serve as a tool of liberation, bringing his people home. It's a balance of justice and grace. Keanu nodded slowly as if absorbing the profound meaning. But I read about another role for Persia in Daniel. The images of the bear, the two-horned ram. What do they say about Persia? Jonathan leaned forward, his voice growing more serious. Indeed, Daniel is key to understanding Persia's fate. As a teenager, Daniel was exiled to Babylon. There, amid a lavish but corrupt palace, God gave him dreams and visions, not just of his time, but of all human history. In one of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, Daniel saw a giant statue with a chest and arms of silver, symbolizing the Medo-Persian Empire. Two arms, two peoples, but Persia stronger, dominating the Medes. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And the bear in Daniel's vision? Jonathan nodded, his voice lowering, tinged with eeriness. In another vision, Daniel saw 4 terrifying beasts rise from the sea. The second was a bear raised on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth. A voice from heaven thundered, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." The bear was Medo-Persia, leaning because Persia outshone the Medes. The 3 ribs were its major conquests, Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. Under Cambyses II, Cyrus's son Persia defeated Egypt, Israel's ancient oppressor, fulfilling the vision. Keanu exhaled, his eyes reflecting awe and unease. So Persia didn't just free Israel, but expanded its empire. Unstoppable. Jonathan nodded, but his eyes held a trace of solemnity. Yes. In another vision, Daniel saw a 2-horned ram, one horn taller than the other, charging west-north and south, unstoppable. An angel explained it was the kings of Media and Persia, the taller horn being Persia. But then a goat from the west, with a single prominent horn, charged and trampled the ram. That was Greece under Alexander the Great, who overthrew Persia. The vision showed Persia, though great, would one day fall. Keanu fell silent as if weighing something. But before its fall, did Persia do anything else for God's people? I heard about Esther. How does she tie to Persia? Jonathan smiled, his eyes brightening, as if about to share an extraordinary tale. Esther is one of the Bible's most unexpected miracles, and it happened at Persia's heart in Susa, in ancient Elam. Under King Ahasuerus, Persia was a vast empire, stretching from India to Ethiopia. Ahasuerus held a 6-month feast, then invited all of Susa to a 7-day celebration. In his pride, he ordered Queen Vashti to display her beauty, but she refused. Humiliated, he deposed her and ordered a search for a new queen. Keanu leaned in, intrigued. And that's how Esther came in. Jonathan nodded, his voice lively. Yes, Esther, born Hadassah, was a Jewish orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai. Chosen for the palace, she underwent a year of preparation, her Jewish identity hidden. With her beauty and wisdom, she won Ahasuerus' heart and became queen. But a deadly plot loomed. Haman, a high official, a descendant of the Amalekites, Israel's ancient enemies, schemed to exterminate all Jews, because Mordecai refused to bow to him. Keanu narrowed his eyes, sensing the stakes. And what did Esther do? Jonathan lowered his voice as if telling a gripping tale. Esther faced a life-or-death choice. To save her people, she had to approach the king uninvited, a crime punishable by death. But she chose to risk it, saying, "If I perish, I perish." With extraordinary courage, she entered the palace. God granted favor, and the king raised his scepter, sparing her. Esther was strategic. She invited the king and Haman to 2 banquets. At the second, she dropped the truth. "My people and I are to be destroyed, and the enemy is Haman." The king, enraged, ordered Haman hanged on the gallows he'd built for Mordecai. But the danger persisted, as the decree to kill the Jews couldn't be revoked. Esther and Mordecai proposed a new decree allowing Jews to defend themselves. The day meant for their destruction became a day of triumph. Keanu exhaled, his eyes filled with admiration. So Persia once again became a protector of God's people. Jonathan nodded, his voice softening with reverence. Exactly. Through Esther, Persia was not just a conquering empire, but a fortress, a throne, and a shield for God's people. But Persia's story doesn't end there. It reappears in an unexpected place in the story of Jesus himself. Keanu leaned back, his eyes brightening, as if another piece of the vast puzzle had emerged in the grand tapestry he was trying to grasp. Keanu tapped his fingers lightly on the Bible, his gaze fixed on Jonathan as if eager to delve deeper into the unfolding mystery. "Jesus," he asked, his voice low but brimming with curiosity. "How does Persia show up in his story?" I thought. After Esther, Persia faded into the background, giving way to empires like Rome. Jonathan gave a gentle smile, his eyes sparking with excitement, as if about to reveal a forgotten gem. "That's the beauty of the Bible, Keanu," he replied, his voice warm, yet carrying a compelling rhythm. "Persia never truly vanishes. Even as Rome dominated, Persia's traces lingered, emerging. In a moment no one expected, when Jesus was born. Do you recall the wise men from the East in Matthew's Gospel?" Keanu nodded slowly, as if piecing it together. The wise men, the ones with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They came from Persia. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice vivid, as if guiding Keanu into an ancient scene. "Yes. In Matthew 2, we read that wise men, or Magi in Greek, came from the East, asking, 'Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star in the East and have come to worship him.' The Bible doesn't specify their origin, but historical evidence and tradition point to the Medo-Persian Empire, modern-day Iran. These Magi weren't kings, but esteemed scholars, astronomers, and priests in Persian society, renowned for their knowledge of stars, ancient texts, and prophetic traditions." Keanu furrowed his brow, his eyes alight with amazement. So they weren't just random travelers, they had a special role. Jonathan nodded, his voice softening with reverence. "A very special role. The Magi belonged to a highly influential class in Persia, trained to study celestial signs and ancient prophecies. Many scholars believe they may have read Daniel's scrolls, who served in the courts of Babylon and Persia centuries earlier. Daniel didn't just interpret dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, he prophesied the Messiah's coming with precise timing. In Daniel 9 he wrote, "From the decree to restore Jerusalem until the Messiah comes, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. If the Magi knew this prophecy, they'd have realized the Messiah's birth was imminent." Keanu exhaled, as if touching a hidden secret. "So the star they saw? It wasn't random." Jonathan shook his head, his eyes gleaming with awe. "Not random at all. When the star appeared, they knew it signaled the Messiah. They left everything, crossed deserts bearing 3 gifts, gold to honor his kingship, frankincense to acknowledge his divinity, and myrrh to foreshadow his sacrifice. No one in Jerusalem, not even Jewish scholars, recognized the sign. But the Magi, pagan Persians, were the first to kneel before Jesus, worshiping him as King, God, and Lamb." Keanu sat still, his eyes pensive, as if envisioning the Magi at Bethlehem's manger. "That makes me think, Persia didn't just free Israel or protect them through Esther. They were the first to recognize the Savior. But why did God give Persia, a foreign nation that honored Jonathan?" leaned in, his voice deepening. "That's how God works, Keanu. He often chooses the unexpected to reveal his plan. Persia from Genesis was woven into God's story, from Magi and Elam, through Cyrus and Esther, to the Magi. They weren't the chosen people, but God used them to show the Messiah came not just for Israel, but for all humanity. The Magi prove no one is beyond his grace. Keanu nodded slowly, his hand brushing the Bible lightly, as if absorbing its meaning. But Persia's story doesn't end. There does it I read in Ezekiel about a final war. Gog and Magog. What's Persia's role in that? Jonathan took a deep breath, his eyes growing grave, as if stepping into shadowy territory. You're right, Keanu. Persia's story doesn't end in Bethlehem. It stretches to the Bible's final pages, in one of its most chilling visions, the war of Gog and Magog. In Ezekiel 38, God tells the prophet, "Set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him." Then God lists Gog's allies, Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them. Persia, modern Iran, is named first in this coalition. Keanu narrowed his eyes, his voice low. So Persia, after all they did freeing Israel, protecting the Jews worshiping Jesus, becomes an enemy in the end. Times Jonathan nodded, but his eyes held no judgment, only contemplation. Yes, but that's what makes Persia's story so complex and profound. In Ezekiel, Gog is often understood by scholars as a powerful leader from the north, possibly linked to Russia or a Eurasian alliance. Cush is modern Sudan. Put is Libya and Gomer, and Togarmah tied to Turkey and the Caucasus. Together they form a massive army described as a storm, sweeping down on Israel, God's restored people. But this attack fails. God intervenes, directly causing chaos with earthquakes, fire from heaven, and devastating judgment. Keanu sat silent as if grappling with the war's meaning. So Persia faces judgment. For standing on the wrong side, Jonathan nodded, but his voice softened. Yes, Persia will face judgment, not because God abandoned them, but because they chose to oppose his people. Ezekiel paints a grim scene, armies destroyed, weapons burning for 7 years. Gog's name synonymous with God's judgment. But the story doesn't end there. There's a glimmer of hope, a promise often overlooked. Keanu leaned forward, his eyes bright with curiosity. Hope? What do you mean? Jonathan lowered his voice, as if sharing a sacred secret. In Jeremiah 49, God speaks of Elam, Persia's core. I will break Elam's bow, its strength. Yet in the last days I will restore Elam's captives. It's a two-sided prophecy, judgment then redemption. Though Persia joins the alliance against Israel and faces consequences, God leaves the door open for restoration. Even in judgment, he offers grace. Keanu exhaled, his eyes reflective, as if seeing the full picture. So Persia, from start to finish, is a story of highs and lows, redemption, fall, judgment, then restoration. Jonathan nodded, his voice deep, touching the story's core. Exactly. Persia mirrors humanity's journey. They began with Magi and Elam. In Genesis, became God's instrument through Cyrus, a stronghold for his people, through Esther, and the first to honor the Messiah through the Magi. But they also fall, joining the alliance against Israel in the end times. Yet Jeremiah's promise shows Persia's story doesn't end in ashes. If they turn to God, they can be restored like any nation. Keanu sat still, his hand resting lightly on the Bible, as if absorbing the entire journey. That makes me think, Persia isn't just a nation. It's like a mirror showing how God works with the whole world. But I'm still wondering, how can a nation go through all those roles, redemption, fall, then salvation again? Jonathan smiled, his eyes warm with empathy. That's the biggest question, Keanu. To answer it, we need to see how God used Persia not just as a tool, but as a testament to his grand plan, a plan that transcends time, nations, and human failures. Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes bright, as if ready to step deeper into the story, where every piece would finally form a complete picture. Keanu gently brushed the Bible's cover, his voice low but magnetic. Jonathan, hearing you talk about Persia, it feels like I'm seeing a story bigger than one nation. It's like a mirror reflecting how God works with humanity. But I want to understand more. Why was Persia chosen to play all these roles, from redemption to fall, then a chance at restoration? And what does that say about us, about the world today? Jonathan sat up straighter, his eyes gleaming with deep focus, as if about to touch the story's heart. That's a profound question, Keanu, he replied, his voice warm. yet carrying a compelling rhythm like a guide revealing a journey's destination. Persia in the Bible isn't just a nation. It's a symbol, a living testament to how God shapes history, not just for one people, but for all humanity. To answer your question, we need to look back at Persia's entire journey, from its earliest days to its final prophecies, and see what it reflects about us. Keanu leaned in, his gaze unwavering, as if awaiting the final piece to complete the picture in his mind. Persia's journey. You said it's like humanity. What do you mean? Jonathan took a deep breath, his voice slow guiding Keanu down a path rich with meaning. Think of Persia from the start. In Genesis, Magi and Elam were small seeds, Noah's descendants placed in history after the flood. They weren't the chosen people, but they were created with purpose. Over centuries, they grew from scattered tribes into a mighty empire. That's their beginning, like humanity created by God with potential, but also with the freedom to choose their path. Keanu nodded, his hands still on the Bible, as if soaking in the insight. And then they became God's instrument right through Cyrus, through Esther. Jonathan nodded, his eyes shining with admiration. Yes, Persia, though pagan, was raised by God to do extraordinary things. Cyrus, a king ignorant of God, became Israel's liberator, rebuilding the temple, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy with stunning precision. Esther, a Jewish girl in Persia's palace, became queen and saved her people from genocide. The Magi Persian scholars were the first to kneel before Jesus, their gifts foreshadowing his destiny. In these moments, Persia symbolized redemption, showing God's use of the unlikely to fulfill his purpose. Keanu frowned slightly, his voice low with unease. But then they fell. In Ezekiel, Persia sides with Gog and Magog against Israel. That feels like betrayal after all they'd done. Jonathan nodded, but his eyes held no judgment, only deep empathy. Yes, and that's what makes Persia a mirror for humanity. Humans, though blessed by God, can still fall. Persia, after its glory, chooses the wrong side in the end times, joining the alliance against God's people. But crucially, God doesn't define them by that failure. Through Jeremiah, he promises to restore Elam, Persia in the last days. The core message is, judgment isn't the end, it's an invitation to return. Keanu exhaled, his eyes pensive, as if seeing a broader picture. So Persia, in all those roles, is a lesson that we can fail, but still have hope. Jonathan smiled softly, his voice warming. Exactly. Persia is a story of grace of God working through flawed people and nations. They were raised to do great things, but fell when they chose wrongly. Yet God never shuts the door. Jeremiah's promise, I will restore Elam's captives, shows that even a wayward nation or person has a path back. That's what makes Persia's story powerful. It's not just about them, it's about us all. Keanu sat silent, absorbing the depth of it. Then he looked up, his voice raw with sincerity. Jonathan, your story about Persia makes me think about today's world. Iran, with what we see in the news, conflicts, tensions, alliances, is it walking the path Ezekiel described? And if so, is the promise of restoration still true? Jonathan took a deep breath, his eyes serious yet gentle. That's a question many ask Keanu. Iran today, with its actions and global stance, may evoke Ezekiel's prophecy of Gog and Magog, with Persia named first. These geopolitical tensions can feel like echoes of prophecy, but we must be careful. Prophecy isn't a fixed map, but a warning and a call to change. Ezekiel shows that if Persia or any nation opposes God's will, they'll face judgment. But Jeremiah reminds us judgment isn't the final word. Keanu leaned forward, his eyes mixing curiosity and concern. You mean Iran still has a chance to change its fate? Jonathan nodded, his voice deep, touching a sacred truth. Yes. Jeremiah's promise that God will restore Elam reminds us no nation or person is forever doomed by their mistakes. The Bible says in the last days, nations will come to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts. Zechariah 14 says, the survivors of the nations that attacked Jerusalem will go up yearly to worship the King and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Perhaps Elam, Iran is among them. If they turn to God, their story won't end in ashes, but in glory. Keanu exhaled, his eyes brightening, as if finding hope amid shadows. That makes me think. If Persia mirrors humanity, then their story is ours too. We all have moments of being lifted up, of falling, and chances to return. Jonathan nodded, his eyes warm with deep empathy. Yes, Keanu. Persia in the Bible reminds us no one is outside God's plan. From Magi and Elam in Genesis through Cyrus, Esther, the Magi, to Gog and Magog, they've walked every stage of the human journey, created, chosen, fallen, judged, and invited back. It tells us that no matter our failures, God keeps the door to redemption open. Keanu sat still, his hand lightly on the Bible, as if feeling the weight of the words. Then he looked up, his voice low but earnest. Jonathan, your story shows Persia isn't just ancient history. It's like a warning, but also a promise. But I'm still wondering, how do we know when a nation or person is on the path to judgment or nearing redemption? Jonathan smiled gently, his eyes wise and kind. That's the core question, Keanu. To answer, we must see how God used Persia to teach us about choice, choosing to follow his will or resist it. Persia's story isn't just history. It's a call for nations and individuals to look into their own mirror. Keanu nodded, his eyes pensive, as if ready to ask one final question, one that would bring them to the heart of Persia's mystery and its meaning for today's world. Keanu gently stroked the Bible's cover, his voice low but deeply sincere. Jonathan, Persia's story from Magi and Elam through Cyrus, Esther, the Magi to Gog and Magog makes me think about what's happening now. Iran with its conflicts, alliances, headlines. Are we watching prophecy unfold? And if so, how can we or anyone find hope in it? How do we know when a nation or person is on the right path to redemption? Jonathan sat silent for a moment, his eyes reflective, as if weighing how to answer a question that reached beyond history to the heart of the present. Then he took a deep breath, his voice warm, yet carrying a quiet strength like a guide leading Keanu through the story's final threshold. Keanu, your question strikes at the core of not just Persia's story, but the Bible's meaning for us today. Persia, from Genesis's first pages to Revelation's final visions, is a mirror not just for nations, but for every person. To answer you, we need to see how God used Persia to teach us about choice, hope, and the path to redemption. Keanu leaned in, his gaze locked on Jonathan, as if awaiting a final light to clarify the grand picture he'd been piecing together. Choice, he asked, his voice low but curious. What do you mean, Persia's choices are ours? Jonathan nodded, his eyes warm with deep empathy. Both, Keanu. Persia over thousands of years made choices, some leading to glory, others to error. When Cyrus chose to free Israel and rebuild the temple, he became an instrument of God's grace, unaware of it. When Esther risked her life to save her people, she chose justice and life. When the Magi left all to follow the star, they chose to pursue truth's light. But in the end, times when Persia joins Gog and Magog, they choose to oppose God's will, leading to judgment. Yet even in judgment, God offers a promise through Jeremiah. He says he'll restore Elam. The greatest lesson is every choice has consequences, but God always leaves a way back. Keanu exhaled, his hand resting lightly on the Bible, as if feeling the weight of the words. So with Iran today, what path do you think they're choosing? And what does that say about us? Jonathan lowered his voice, as if sharing a sacred truth. Iran, like any nation, faces the same crossroads as biblical Persia. What we see in the news, conflicts, alliances, tensions, may remind us of Ezekiel's prophecy about Gog and Magog. But the Bible isn't a fixed script. Prophecy is a warning, a call to change before it's too late. If Iran or any nation chooses a path against God's will, they'll face consequences, as Ezekiel described. But Jeremiah's promise that Elam will be restored reminds us no nation is forever doomed. That's true for every person too. We all face moments to choose to walk in light or step into darkness. Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes pensive, as if tying Persia's story to his own reflections. That makes me think, Persia isn't just a historical nation. It's a mirror showing we can fail, but have a chance to make it right. But how do we know when we're choosing right? When a nation or person is nearing redemption? Jonathan smiled softly, his eyes wise and gentle. That's the question we all face, Keanu. The Bible doesn't give a simple formula, but it offers signs. For Persia, redemption came when they aligned with God's will, like Cyrus freeing Israel, Esther saving her people, the Magi worshiping Jesus. Their fall came when they turned away, as in Gog and Magog. For us, redemption begins when we choose to turn to God, listen to his voice, and live by his truth. It's not about perfection, but about opening our hearts to his guidance. Keanu sat silent, absorbing the depth of it. Then he looked up, his voice raw with sincerity. Jonathan, your story shows Persia isn't just ancient history. It's a reminder that everything nations, people, even mistakes is part of God's plan. But I'm still wondering, how can we live with that hope when today's world is full of conflict and division? How do we believe redemption is real, not just for Persia, but for us all? Jonathan took a deep breath, his eyes shining as if about to share a truth that could change everything. Keanu, the hope in Persia's story isn't that everything will be easy, but that God never gives up. From Genesis, when Magi and Elam were named, to Revelation, when Persia faces judgment and a chance at restoration, God is always there, guiding, inviting. For today's world, hope lies in our ability to choose forgiveness over hatred, light over darkness, God over wandering. Persia's story teaches us that no matter how many mistakes we make, God keeps his promise. Zechariah says nations, even those who oppose Jerusalem, will worship the king. That's hope not just for Iran, but for us all. Keanu exhaled, his eyes bright as if finding the final piece. So Persia, in all its roles, is a call to look at ourselves and choose the right path. Jonathan nodded, his voice low, filled with deep reverence. Exactly. Persia is a mirror reflecting humanity's journey, created with purpose, lifted by grace, fallen by wrong choices, but always invited back through redemption. Every one of us, every nation, has a story like Persia's. Each day we choose to follow the path of Cyrus, Esther, and the Magi, or that of Gog and Magog. But whatever we choose, God is there, with the door to redemption always open. Keanu sat still, his hand lightly on the Bible, as if feeling the weight of the entire story. He looked up, his eyes no longer curious, but peaceful, as if he'd found what he sought. Jonathan, this story, it's not just about Persia. It's about all of us, about how we face our choices, our failures, and the hope that everything can be made right. Jonathan smiled, his eyes warm with empathy and faith. Yes, Keanu, Persia, from the Bible's first to last pages, reminds us no one is outside God's plan. Whether a nation like Iran or a person like you or me, we all have a story, and that story, if we choose to turn to God, will never end in darkness. The space between the two men grew still but not heavy. It was a stillness rich with meaning, as if they'd walked a long journey together, from Madi's mountains to Cyrus's palace, from Bethlehem's manger to the visions of the end. The Bible on the table, though untouched, seemed to bear silent witness, testifying to the story told, and the story still being written in every heart.